Jones of 4332 Blackberry Lane, Lansing, Michigan 48917. George's phone number is area code 517-321-0779. The recording was made at the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River in Lansing on November 22nd, 1988 by Jim Walkinshaw and Helen Earley. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Okay, George, I think we're on. If you would do that, please. Give us your name and phone number and address, please.
My name is George T. Jones. Currently live at 4332 Blackberry Lane. My phone number is 321-0779.
Is that in Lansing or East Lansing?
Well, it's Lansing mailing address, but it's actually in Marmore subdivision.
I see, and the 48917, is that your?
48917 is the zip code.
Thank you.
Great. Then maybe, George, if you would just take us back to when you got started at Oldsmobile and what circumstances surrounded that. Bring us forward.
Well, I got started at Oldsmobile as a result of writing a letter to C.L. McEwen.
Now, he was then, who was?
He was general manager.
Of Oldsmobile.
I saw his picture and a write-up in the Pittsburgh Press Sunday paper. Oh, this would be very close to around New Year's Day on 1934. And I had been writing letters to everybody that I thought I might be able to make contact with, and I wrote about 40 letters. And as a result, I got about 38 very frosty replies. But one of them, fortunately, one of the warmer ones, was from a Mr. Harold Youngren. Youngren was chief engineer of Oldsmobile. He had just been hired into this position from Buick by Mr. McEwen. I didn't know that, but that's why I got my answer from Mr. Youngren. And I didn't get a job on that letter. I got a very nice 2-page single-spaced letter. A lot of understanding, a lot of encouragement, but no job.
Okay.
Well, that kind of warmed my heart, and I kept that letter. Well, I kept it around for several years, but it got lost someplace, and my family's moving. I don't have it anymore. But anyhow, around about April, on March the 15th, I guess, of the same year, I read in the paper that things were picking up in the automobile business, and they were expecting to have better production for the rest of the year. So I thought, well, I'll just write Mr. Youngman another letter. It was to be my first one to him. I wrote it to him and told him what I had read in the papers, and I wondered if it was going to mean any opportunities available for fellows like myself. And he wrote me back another very nice letter, very warm and friendly, nothing professional about it, telling me that, yeah, things were looking up in the automobile business, but he didn't think that there was going to be anything to get excited about in the way of opportunities. But he ended it up with something that I never forgot. His last 2 words in the last 2 sentences in the last paragraph was, however, if you were out of work and in the vicinity, it might make a difference. So at that time, I had dropped out of school. I was working in the coal mines, and I arranged to be out of work. That was very easy. And I asked my father if I could borrow the company car for a trip to Michigan, and he said, yes, I could.
How old were you then?
I was 18. I was in my 3rd year at University of Pittsburgh. And anyhow, I just started my 3rd year. Anyhow, I was looking forward to getting an answer from Mr. Youngman. I just felt in my heart he'd give me an answer. But I got better than a letter, I got a telegram. I wasn't home when it arrived, but my mother got it. She wasn't going to give it to me. But she was no poker player either. I could tell something was wrong. So I finally got the letter, and I was supposed to meet Mr. Youngman in Pittsburgh the following morning at 10 o'clock. This was on a Tuesday night, and I was supposed to meet him on a Wednesday at the BOP sales room. Well, I didn't know where the BOP sales room was in Pittsburgh, that big place. So I left home about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I got to Pittsburgh about 6. And on the way in, I stopped at all the big gas stations because I was a gas station man. I worked for Gulf Gasoline in Pittsburgh while I was going to school. And I asked him where the BOP sales room was. Nobody ever heard of it. I finally got downtown where I used to work, and I stopped in there and told the fellows my dilemma. And the manager, he didn't know where the BOP sales room was either. But he says, let me call our district manager. He says, he might know. So he calls the district manager, and the guy says, oh, he says, that's the Buick Olds Pontiac sales room over in Baum Boulevard. I was only about 10 blocks away from it. So we got there on time. And I never forget Mr. Youngman coming out at this meeting. It was a dealers council meeting, you know. All the dealers come, Ray's Hob was the factory manager. And he was glad to get out of that, I guess, because he come over to see me. And I might say I was fortunate to have that telegram with me, or I wouldn't have never got into this place, because the girl didn't believe me when I told her I had a date with Mr. Youngman. Anyhow, he come out right away. His first words to me as he approached me was, so you're Jones? I said, yes, sir. He says, you're not the guy I expected to see. Well, he couldn't have done any worse if he'd hit me with a wet fish. But I don't know who puts these words in your mouth. I come back at him and I says, well, sir, you're not the guy I expected to see either. And he got kind of serious. He says, just who did you expect to see? I told him I expected to see a little older man, more portly, less hair, and horn-rimmed glasses. And he thought a little bit, and he laughed real hard. He said, you expected to see my boss, and that was C.L. McEwen. But I had this picture of C.L. McEwen in my mind.
Oh, yeah.
So after that, we went off into one of these little rooms that the salesman used to close sales, you know. And we got very comfortable. He was on one side of the desk and me on the other. And we got very well acquainted. And he really picked my brain. We talked about everything under the sun. Then it come about noontime, he says, have you got any plans for lunch? I says, no, sir. I says, I hadn't even had lunch on my mind. He said, why don't you come with me? We're going to the King Edward Tavern. Well, I knew where the King Edward Tavern was. That was a rather prominent place in Pittsburgh, but I had never been there. So we got there, and here was all these dealers from around that area in the room. And when he came in the room again, they spotted him, and man, they just mobbed him with questions. And I remember we were eating our lunch, and I was beside him, and I was practically overrun by dealers, reaching across me, getting in front of me and everything. But anyhow, he says to me, he says, are you enjoying this? Well, I says, yes, I'm enjoying it, but I says, I don't mind telling you, I feel like a fish out of water. And he said, he says, I'm not even enjoying it. He said, let's get out of here. So we got out of there. And we went out to his car. Well, I noticed as we approached the car that it wasn't a production 1934 Oldsmobile. It was one that had some rework done on it because the rear quarters were different in that the wheel opening was not the same spot in the fender that it was on the production cars. And otherwise it looked like a 1934 Oldsmobile. And so when we got in the car, I asked him about that, and it kind of surprised him. I think it impressed him that I noticed that, but it surprised him. And he said, well, yeah, he says, this is a 1935 production car, 34 body. We went up and down hills in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's pretty hilly.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought he was a wild driver. When we come down these hills, lickety split, stop on a dime, and all that kind of stuff. You know, we did this all afternoon. And he would say, boy, these brakes are really great. I finally asked him what was so great about the brakes, and he says, well, aren't they nice and smooth? And I said, very nice and smooth. He said, well, he says, they're hydraulic brakes. I says, Oldsmobile doesn't have hydraulic brakes. He says, they will have next year.
Mm-hmm.
And they did have.
Mm-hmm.
Then about, it was about 4:15 in the afternoon, and we hadn't talked anything about jobs yet. That's what was foremost in my mind. So I said to him, Mr. Younger, I says, I've had a fine time today, but I says, the truth is I come down here to look for a job, and I says, I don't know whether I got one or not. And he got real serious again. He said, well, he says, I've got a job to offer you. Naturally, he says, I wouldn't ask you down here. But he says, you're so damn young. I says, well, what's that got to do about it? He says, well, how's your mother and father feel about you leaving home? I says, well, I've been away from home for 2.5 years already going to school. I says, they didn't mind that. I says, I don't think they'll mind it. I says, just leave it up to me. He says, okay. I says, you got a job. I says, doing what? He says, in the drafting room. He says, how much money do you want? Well, I was prepared for him there. I told him that I figured that I could live conservatively, pay a little bit on my indebtedness, and maybe save a little bit if I could get $80 a month. And he says to me, oh, hell, he says, I wouldn't ask anybody to work for $80 a month. He says, how's 100 sound to you? And I assured him that it sounded much better. And then I add, and here's something that I never even knew existed. But in my concern to do things right, I asked him if I could have a letter of confirmation. Well, that kind of surprised him, and he looked at his watch and he said, well, maybe we can get back to the agency in time to catch the secretary. And we did. She was putting her typewriter away just as we got there. But he prevailed on her to take a letter, and she did reluctantly. And so I had a letter of confirmation. And that's one of the smartest things I ever did, because back in those days, they didn't have any personnel department at Oldsmobile. You did all your business with the guy that hired you.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't have even got past the gate by the old motor plant there on Elm Street if I hadn't had that letter with me.
Mm-hmm.
Then when I did get there, I had one of the biggest surprises yet. He didn't have a job for me.
Oh, he didn't?
No. He didn't think I'd come. He
Really?
didn't think my folks would let me come. But I got to give him credit, though. I sit in the lobby in the old engineering building in Building 34 from 8 o'clock in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and they found a job for me.
Where was that?
Well, I was in Building 34.
Yes, but what job was that?
I was in the blueprint room. This was beneath what I was promised,
Yeah.
but I had my foot in the door. That was more important to me than what I was doing, you see. And
What did you do in the blueprint room, Charlie?
just routine work, mostly filing and things like that.
Where was that at that time? Was that on the second floor?
Yes, on the second floor of Building 34.
Okay.
And there were some other fellows in there too that expected to get out on the drafting board.
Uh-huh.
And so I was reconciled that, well, if I was going to make any progress here, I had to get in line. But the more I worked with these guys, I'm not going to mention any names, but the more I worked with them, the more I was convinced that anything they could do, I could do better. But how are you going to show it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had a chief draftsman there, conservative old Canadian, and I went to him and I told him that I had had considerable drafting training and that I wanted to keep my talents whetted up and alive, you know. And I would appreciate it if he could give me some work to do at night so I'd come back and do it. I wasn't doing anything else. I didn't own a car in those days, you know. And by this time, I was living in the Washington Apartments, which was relatively close.
Mhm.
I was in there with three other men from Oldsmobile. Two of them were married men from Flint that used to work here during the week. And the other one was a guy by the name of Bert Bartlett, who was happened to be my boss. He was the head of the records in Oldsmobile Engineering. And he knew that I was back there working too. Well, anyhow, McEwen, being the conservative old guy that he was, and a rather proud General Motors stockholder, but he thought he was getting something for nothing, boy. He was all for it, and he really loaded me up with work. I never ran out of work, but I enjoyed it. And in the meantime, about the Christmas before all this happened, we had a man come in by the name of Morris Thorne. He came from Studebaker, presumably. But as I got to know him better, I found out that he had also been chief engineer of Pierce Arrow in Buffalo years ago. Well, Thorne was a perfect gentleman. Anybody he saw that looked personable, he'd smile and speak to. You got the idea he knew you. And I thought he knew me. I used to see him out every night. Bartlett and I would go out to lunch at the old home dairy cafeteria. Here would be Thorne. We'd be very friendly. I assumed he knew who I was. But anyhow, he had been instrumental in developing a concept for using the new, what was called the ATJ transmission on the 1937 cars. ATJ was automatic transmission. This was before the fluid clutch. It was introduced with a mechanical clutch. This required it would have required a special cross member, even if it was been the hydromatic, but you couldn't use the same motor mounting cross member you did for synchronous. And this motor mounting cross member detail was up for release. It was made, the detail was made at A.O. Smith, and we had a Van Dyke of it to release for our own interest. It got chewed up in the blueprint machine. Well, Bartlett went and got all the pieces because he was an innovative man too. He liked to get his work done. Come hell or high water, he had to get his work done. He pasted all the pieces together on a cardboard and came over to me and asked me if I could make him a new drawing of it in time to get the prints run tonight so he could get his production out in the morning. And I said, sure I can. And in the morning, why, here was these prints going over Maury Thorne's desk. He was interested in that cross member because that was about the only new thing that was on that car. And so he opens the print up to look at it, and he noticed that instead of being a white print with blue lines like you'd get from a Van Dyke, it was a blueprint with white lines. So he got a hold of Bartlett and says, how's come we're releasing our requirements drawing instead of A.O. Smith's production drawing? Well, Bartlett explained to him what had happened, and it wasn't our requirements drawing, it was a duplicate of the A.O. Smith drawing. Well, when I made the drawing, I made a mistake. Not in the drawing, but in the records end of it. Down here in the title block, instead of saying drawn by A.O. Smith, then up in the change block, redrawn G.T. Jones. Down here where it says drawn by, I put Jones. Well, Thorne looked the drawing over, and Bartlett told him that one of the boys in the blueprint room was been trying to get out of the drafting room, and he made this drawing for him. So he looked it over and he approved of it very much. And he looked down the corner and says, Jones. Who the hell's Jones? He says, send him in to see me. So Bartlett sent me in to see Thorne. And the minute he saw me, he says, oh, he says, so you're Jones. And I says, yes, sir. He says, I understand you made this drawing last night. I says, yes, sir. He says, how long did it take you? I said, about an hour and 15 minutes. He says, boy, he says, you ought to be out in the drafting. I says, I've been telling John Alphys that for 2 years. That afternoon I went out.
So all that paid off.
Oh, sure, it paid off. And then we were entering a new front suspension design program. Up to this time, we had always used Ford's lower control arms, about 22 or 24 inches long, similar to, well, I think they were duplicates of Buick's. Buick made them in their Ford plant. But you see, Oldsmobile was always a stamping plant. And one of Thorne's ideas was to get that away from Buick and make it an Oldsmobile. And he had to have a design program. We had to design a whole new front suspension around stamp details rather than Ford's. And one thing I'll never understand is why he trusted me to do that, because he didn't know anything about my work. He knew I could draw, but he didn't know anything about my engineering ability. But he did. I was his lead-off man on that whole program. And Thorne and I have been very good friends ever since. I can tell you a lot of more incidents with Thorne that cement our friendship, but that was the beginning.
And that was for what, the 35 or 36?
Oh, that was from the 38 now.
The 38, okay.
38 and 39. Anyhow, that's how I got started in the drafting.
And the reasons behind the sheet metal one versus the forged one was because we were the stamping kind of
We
thing?
were a stamping plant that had been forged.
Because we didn't have our forge plant that we,
That's right.
at that juncture. Okay.
And we made the arms shorter,
Mm-hmm.
and I gotta believe they were lighter weight. I don't know sure they were.
George, what was in the 34 area from an engineering standpoint? Do you remember what was in the building?
It's all the chassis design, all the chassis sheet metal.
Okay. Now, was that all on top of the second floor? What was where?
Chassis administrative offices were on the second floor. The first floor were the general engineering administrative offices, chief
Okay.
engineer, assistant chief engineer. The body section was on the first floor.
Yeah,
And in back of all that was the experimental garage and machine shop
okay.
on the Jeanette.
So all the offices were kind of at the north end up by Pine Street or up by Elm Street?
Street. Building 34 is, if you go in
They go
from
in,
Pine Street,
yeah,
across the parking lot and everything,
Right.
you come to the front of.
but that's Elm
Building 34.
Street. But
Okay, I see what
you were up at the north end of the building. Okay. And then the back half towards the plant was where the shops were? And the machine shop was back there?
machine shop, experimental garage.
Okay.
Because they weren't as large a departments as they
No.
grew into eventually.
True. But the second floor was on the building and it was you.
It was kind of a makeshift second floor. The building didn't go up that high.
Yeah.
It was like what do you call them when it's all glassed in?
Yeah, a big skylight area.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And it was cold in the wintertime.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, we used to sit around with our coats and scarves and gloves on until 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun warming up. But it beat working in the coal mine, so I
Oh,
don't know.
sure.
You mentioned John Oswell. How did he spell his last name?
Oswald,
Oswald, O-S-W-A-L-D?
no, O-L-D,
O-S-W-O-L-D?
yes. Was body engineer. He later went to Ford in charge of styling for a while. Youngren finally went to Ford's too about 1944.
Yeah. Now, George, after did you do any other work then on the transmission thing during that period of time?
No, I didn't do any work on the transmission except
Just the
redraw
support?
that one
Uh-huh.
cross member that got
Okay.
chewed up.
Uh-huh. What did you do then after the suspension business that you worked on?
Well, by the time we got through with the suspension, we used to make tracings for permanent records when we ran out of design work to do.
Mhm.
And that's what we did a lot of. But this time the war was coming along.
Okay. What happened then during the war? What were you doing then?
During the war, got involved in a lot of things for short periods. 37 millimeter shell production, 20 millimeter, the Spanish Hueso, conversion. This was a 20 millimeter gun, converting it from a mechanical bolt to electrical bolt. That was the biggest thing I got involved in.
And what did that involve?
Well, it involved redesigning the bolt so that it would be an electric bolt instead of a mechanical bolt. This would make it so that the pilots that were using these machines in their airplanes wouldn't have to hand charge the gun to start using it.
Okay.
You could just touch a
Punch.
button and it went on, yeah.
Mhm.
And that was a very enlightening period. Designing the thing was no particular problem. All we had to do was make sure that everything that was electrified was insulated and all that kind of stuff. How to insulate it, story. We had pretty close liaison with the Air Force in those days. They had a guy or a couple of guys who would come in every week and look over our shoulder. And they insisted that we ought to make this insulator for the bolt out of molded nylon. Nylon was just new then. Nylon was the thing. Nobody knew anything about it, but that was what we were supposed to use. So we made it a molded nylon bolt insulator. And we had a few guns made up that way, and they took them over on the range, which used to be right behind the engineering building underground.
Mhm.
And they give it a initial shot, which would be about one touch of a button, but it would be 5 shells, and examine it, and the nylon insulation had just all crumbled.
Mm.
That was a big disappointment. Well, there was other things in the gun that we wanted to test outside of the insulation, so I had to dream up a bolt that we could make in a machine shop out of non-conductor materials. And we did. Tony Waters was the engineer at that time, and Tony was very helpful to me on that thing too. Between us, we conceived the design, and I finally drew up. And all it was parts machined out of spaldite, if you know what spaldite is. Well, spaldite is the phenolic impregnated canvas material that they used to make timing gears out of.
Mhm.
Very tough. Well, we made one that had these spaldite washers on it, held together by steel washers and pins through them and everything. It worked okay, but it wasn't anything that you'd be proud of to say that it's very innovative. It was adaptive, it wasn't innovative.
Mhm.
But when they put that in the gun, it worked, and it worked forever. We finally went to production with that experimental design.
Isn't that interesting? Now, the engineering for those kinds of things was done where? Physically?
Over here at Oldsmobile in Building 34.
That was done in 34,
Yep. Oh, no, I gotta take it back. They were done in 66,
64, 64.
64, yeah.
Right. Okay, so at some point in time, you moved from 34 to 64.
That was about 1937, I think.
Okay. And when you moved over there then, do you remember how things were organized, where things were?
Oh, gee. It was just like jumping from the hog pen into the parlor.
Uh-huh.
That was real living. I remember when we moved into 64, I remember this.
Okay. Where did you end up then? Where were you physically located?
Well, I was on the second floor,
Okay.
still on the drafting floor.
Uh-huh. And what was downstairs?
Stairs was the west end of the building was the garage, experimental garage.
Okay.
On the south of them, there was the laboratories. And on the second floor was the machine shop, experimental assembly. And parts warehousing, things like that. On the third floor where we had paint shop.
Okay.
One half of it, the east half of the third floor was an auditorium.
Okay. What did you use the auditorium for in those days?
Oh, it was opened to the public for things that they might want to use. Various organizations in town would get up there, like the Women's Auxiliary of the St. Lawrence Hospital, the Women's Auxiliary of the Sparrow Hospital, they'd have something, they used to use it for that. We used to use it for monthly meetings and the GM Men's Club, and things like that. And we used to have special programs.
Okay.
Sales department used to use it too. A lot of things, I don't know what, I never got into those things.
Now, during the wartime, when we were not making cars, did the auditorium get used for anything?
Well, just things like I told you.
Those same kinds of events? Okay. Okay, we're on.
You had mentioned that on the second floor of Building 64, there was a parts area.
Yeah, parts.
Now, were those automobile parts,
Oh, sure,
replacement
there were parts
parts?
there were a lot of them were production parts that they get from production to keep on hand for building their experimental cars.
I see, but nothing like that was going on during the war, was it? Or were they?
We weren't building any cars during.
No, so that's what I mean. So these parts then were, when you mentioned parts, that was
They were gun
before the
parts.
war. Oh, those were gun parts. I see.
Did you get in the little firing range, George,
I was in it, yes.
when they were firing things?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Just hold your ears, I saw.
You actually just stuck your fingers in your ears?
Well, the people that worked over there, they had things that they put over their ears.
Like earmuffs or something? Uh-huh. How many guns would they fire at a time down there? Okay. But they had a regular gun mounting place, and did they fire every gun they made?
Reason we're going to find out about.
Okay. What? Go
I was
ahead.
gonna say, was that a 24-hour thing, or was it just an 8-hour day, or did they run 2 shifts?
I don't think they ran 2 shifts, and I'm not sure that it operated every day, but the facilities.
Yeah,
I see.
okay,
Maybe it did operate every day, but I didn't have that close a contact.
okay. Other than the 20 millimeter, what, did you work on other kinds of ordnance work?
I never did, no.
Okay. And you stayed there in Building 64 was your office during that whole period of time?
Who was your boss then?
Well, it started off under the direction of Maury Thorne. But in 1941, C.L. McEwen was made vice president in charge of research. I think at the General Motors Research Labs. And he wanted Mr. Thorne to go down with him to be in charge of vehicle development for research. So that's when I kind of severed connections with Thorne.
Mm-hmm.
I've kept in contact with him ever since. He's got a beautiful place in Virginia on the south bank of the Potomac River. Probably 40, 50 miles east of the birthplace of Robert E. Lee.
Mm-hmm.
And this piece of property, I understand, had been in his wife's family for 300 years.
Hmm.
They got their charter from the King of England.
Who was your boss after Thorne?
Oh, let me think. We didn't have anybody that actually filled Thorne's shoes per se. We had a bunch of people that were not quite up to his standard that were in charge of various projects. C.K. Lennon was one. And I worked for him for a while. This is new product design.
Mm-hmm.
And, eventually, the war was over and then we were back into automobiles again.
George, before you get into the auto business again, did you know C.L. McEwen enough to have what I would call a you could give us an overview of what kind of an individual he was?
Well, I can tell you what kind of an individual he was, but it would be all observation.
All right,
I had no personal contact with him.
okay,
However, in later years, I got to know his son very well. He and I worked together at Tech Center.
oh, yes. Well, then,
I've often thought that the reason he had so much interest in my letter that I wrote him was because he had a boy that was about the same age at home.
Mhm.
I've always felt that.
mhm.
You never actually visited with him.
No,
Did he come out in the plant or come over in building 34?
oh, I
64?
guess he did. He did. He didn't come to see me. I'm sure.
Well, I mean, did you see him often around looking at,
Yeah.
talking with the various superintendent?
Working in the blueprint, I used to have to make a lot of print deliveries over to the old building administration.
60. Mhm.
I used to see him.
But he didn't know who you were, or did he?
I have no idea. If I was to make a positive guess, I'd say no, he didn't know who I was. He may have knew of me, but I don't think he knew who I was.
Now, he left and Sherrod Skinner arrived,
Right.
okay? And then he was with us during that whole war period,
Well, and after,
okay? Now, after the war, at some point in time, or during the latter part of the war, we must have got started back on working on car engineering again.
yes, this started, I'd say about 1945.
Okay,
We were getting some concepts for cars out of research. And by this time, Mr. Youngman had tapped me to be his personal designer. And one of the months I was doing all the advanced design work that Oldsmobile did.
mhm,
We didn't do anything on a broad scale like a whole concept for an automobile. We used to do things that would fit into somebody else's concept, things like that. And well, working for Jack Wolfman was a real experience. He was he wasn't what I would call a demanding man, but if you didn't do certain things that were parallel to his motivation, you didn't work for him long. I say that now. I didn't realize it at the time, but just so happened that he and I had the same motivations and we got along with it.
mhm,
Like, for instance, he used to come out and he'd say he had an idea. He wanted to investigate for a presentation to engineering staff for their consideration. And we'd talk about it, like about from 9 o'clock in the morning till 10:30 or 11. And then I presumed to make a kind of a comprehensive sketch by tracing a lot of drawings. This would be plus or minus a 16th, you see. Conceptual, but
mhm.
nothing that you could scale for engineering purposes. And when I got that done, I'd go into his office and ask him if that was approaching what he had in mind. And that, after I got it to the point where he was satisfied with it, he'd say, well, okay, now we want to leave for Detroit. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. Well, that used to floor me. I didn't know how I was going to get it done that quick
Mhm.
because prior to this time, I'd always had to have my overtime authorized. Didn't have to, but it always was. But I thought to myself, well, I'll be damned if I'm going to ask him what I'm going to do it. If he expects me to do it, I'll do it. So I used to work till 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. But I always had it done in time to go at 10 o'clock in the morning. And he really responded to that. I found him, we got along great.
Mhm.
He never asked me when I got it done, but he was smart enough to know that I didn't just punch a button and it happened.
What kinds of things might you have Do you remember any specific kind of example?
Oh, we used to talk about appendages on the transmission for different purposes, or we talked about power brake servos and different things like that. It's
Mhm.
just unitized engineering rather than overall.
Was it more mechanical kinds of things?
All mechanical.
All mechanical. Okay.
Yeah, we didn't do anything aesthetic in Oldsmobile. That always come out of styling section.
Would like new suspension
All
systems
that would
and
come out of Oldsmobile.
that kind of stuff?
But we were very much satisfied with the suspension we had developed about 10 years earlier. This one that Thorne originated, you know?
Mhm.
Well, that was in for many years. That was very successful.
Okay, so how, that was, you called that the advanced design, is that what you called that? That section, the thing that you were,
We didn't have a name.
didn't have a name for that?
It's just that that kind of work gravitated to me.
Uh-huh.
Was there anyone else working on similar concepts?
Oh, we used to have a man that was very good. We call him the name of Hank Earley. That was an old German. Well, I shouldn't say an old German. He was a young German during World War One, and he came over here after World War One and got located at Oldsmobile.
Mhm.
And he used to do some of this along with me, but then he died about 19, it had to be around 1946 or so, I guess. And it was a funny thing. He lived up here in a house on Delaware Road, just about straight through there.
Mhm.
Big little farmhouse on the south side. I had been out with my son for a walk. My son was about 5 years old at this time. And Hank come along in the car and picked us up. He had had a heart attack, and he'd been off work for a couple of months. But he told me that he was coming back to work half days. Following it'd be a couple of days before he got started. And but he also told me that he was a changed man. And I wondered how he meant. Well, Hank had been pretty much like most of the people get a job. They want this, they want that, they want a bunch of other things, and if they don't get what they want, they're not happy and all this and that. Well, Hank wasn't happy because prior to World War II, he had been sent back to Germany from Oldsmobile to work at Opel. I remember going to his going away party. But just before the war started, he was an American citizen by this time. He was brought back to this country. Well, and he was put into the new operations like the Ford's plant that was just new in that. And he had good jobs and all that, but they weren't quite as prestigious as what he enjoyed at Opel.
Mhm.
And he thought that he was being singled out for some reason. He was unhappy. But anyhow, he says, he said, when I had that heart attack, went to the hospital, he says, I didn't know what to expect. He said, but geez, he says, you lay there and you wonder how your family's going to get along and everything. And he says, all of a sudden, here comes your paycheck. And he says, that check comes every 2 weeks, just like when you're working. He says, you can't imagine what a consolation that is. He says, that helps you get better. And he told me that he's going to be a changed man. Well, he never got back to work because he had a massive heart attack before he got back to work and died. But learn how to count your blessings.
Yeah.
When you went down to Detroit, would that be to the GM building or to the tech center?
Well, when we first started going down to Detroit, the tech center didn't exist. We had to go to the GM research in the, well, it was on Milwaukee Avenue in back of the GM building. And they had about 20 floors there or something like that. And that's where I first met up with Hardy Earl and the styling section.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever do much, have much contact with Mr. Earl?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, I got to know Hardy Earl in his tapering off period. He did hang around until he got the styling or the tech center built, but I didn't see much of him after that.
Mm-hmm.
But Hardy Earl was a very fine gentleman. Tall, smiling, and very condescending. In those days, I only weighed about 115 pounds, but these guys were all 6'4" and everything. But if they knew that you was from Oldsmobile or any other company for that matter, and the company trusted you down there, you were welcome. And if you went in and got in an elevator with Hardy Earl, he always greeted you like a long lost brother.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say that that's true of most of the men that I worked for at General Motors. There's only one man that I worked for that I don't care if I ever see again. I'm not going to tell you who he is. The rest of them turned out to be real fine gentlemen as far as a working relationship is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of these men were not what you'd call polished gentlemen in the citizenry of the city and all that kind of stuff. But if you did your work by their standards, I found them to be very, very warm, concerned people, and very, very generous as far as remuneration was concerned, particularly on bonuses. That's how they used to do it.
Well, what happened after the 40s?
After the 40s?
Mm-hmm. What were you working on then in the later 40s?
Well, we were talking about these new concept cars coming
Mhm.
out of engineering staff.
Would that been not the 42 ones, but the
Oh, no,
49
no,
style?
This would be 49s.
Yeah.
But they weren't anything aimed at production. They were concepts.
Mhm.
I forget the man's name that was in charge of that program. He was an old Graham Page engineer. But my job was to keep up with those and sit down with Jim Dykstra and a few other people, and we'd pick them apart for their good parts and their bad parts and that. And this is when I got to know Sherrod Skinner. He was interested in them too, and he used to come over and look over my shoulder when I was working on the board. We'd talk about this and that and a few other things. And that went on for a couple of years.
Now the car, were you there during the strike? You must have been, the big strike in
That was
46
1940.
or 7 or 5 or
45.
whatever it was.
Yeah, I was there. We were not working at Oldsmobile. We got shunted down to Detroit.
Oh, on purpose? Uh-huh.
And that was a real revelation to me, how people's personalities can change so by circumstance. We used to come back to Lansing every Friday night. And we, of course, would have to go in the garage and unload our cars and stuff like that. Well, these guys that were striking had bonfires on the outside. They had to because in the wintertime. And these guys that had been your friends for 10, 15 years, they snarl at you. You couldn't believe it.
They keep you out? Did they keep you
Oh,
out?
no, they couldn't keep us out. They didn't have that prerogative.
Mm-hmm.
But they made it very unpleasant to go in.
Just because they belonged to the union and you didn't?
Well, I don't think that was it. The thing was, we were living as usual, and they weren't. The fact that we belonged to the union or not, I don't think entered into it. I don't think that all union members feel that way anymore, but they did back then.
Mhm.
There's a few of them in the plant that feel that way yet,
Oh, yeah,
but attrition's going to take care of them.
that's right.
I really had my eyes open and the philosophical differences between the younger generation and the old timers when I worked over here at this training center on Saginaw Street.
Mhm.
We had old timers and we had new ones in there. And we were talking about the Duran process. And it was an interesting thing, but I learned much more than when I trained anybody, I'm pretty sure. These old timers would come in and they'd sit there real sour, you know. And we had this program where we'd divide the class into teams and we'd give the teams assignments. I remember this one guy who says, "Hey, when am I supposed to do this?" I said, "Gosh, I don't know." I said, "I don't know what your time is. Do it whenever you find time to do anything else you'd like to do." And he says, "Well," he says, "you're talking about my time." I says, "I presume so." He says, "Well," he says, "Oldsmobile's going to get more out of this than me. If I can't do it on their time, I don't want any part of it." So I says, "Well, I can only presume you will be one of the more valued members of your team, and I'll let you go with that." Well, we had another guy. He used to be a real sourpuss. He'd come in and wouldn't smile from class start, class end. But this one day, he came in on a Thursday, and man, he was smiling from ear to ear. And every time I looked at him during the class period, he still had this big smile on. So we finally got through the class period and into the work session, and I signed a little for him and told him, "You must have had an awful good stroke of luck." He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, you've been smiling from ear to ear irrepressibly ever since you got here." He tried to wipe it off, you know, and look serious. He said, "Well," says, "I just heard that the bumper plant made 1,386 rejected bumper bars last night." This was plating, not standard. I said to him, "Well, gee, how are they going to maintain production with that kind of a performance?" And he was having an awful time repressing his smile, but he tried. And he says, "Oh, we're going to have to work overtime this weekend." I shouldn't have that on tape, but there it is.
Well, no, but that's true, and I was there too. I mean, I've heard those stories too, George, so. Take us back now go back a little bit again, because you got to your retired, and you jumped from 50s to retired already. So what happened from the late 40s, early
Well,
50s?
okay.
What were you working on in those
In
times?
about 1950, I think it was, I got taken off of the board and put in charge of chassis design.
Okay.
And that went along really well. That's when I got taken off of classified and put on unclassified.
Mhm.
And
Now, in that job, you must have had a bunch of folks working for you.
about 30,
Okay.
And who did you report to then?
I reported to Jim Dykstra.
What, can you remember some of the things that might have gone on in that era?
Well, one of the ones that stands out because it was such a bust was air ride.
Oh, good subject. Would like to know about air ride. Yeah.
Well, air ride was a design challenge, not from the standpoint of function, but from the standpoint of keeping a lot of stuff interchangeable with the non-air ride cars.
Mhm.
And we succeeded.
Why did air ride come to pass? Somebody must have thought that was,
Well, so I can't remember for sure anymore, but I have the impression in thinking back that somebody heard that Ford was working on it, or Chrysler or somebody. We had to beat them out with it anyhow. We did.
Now, Oldsmobile, did Buick have that also?
Oh, yeah.
Was that a coordinated kind of thing or?
Well, no, we didn't do much coordination about it.
Okay,
That was what made it so much fun.
so we went off and did our own thing. Okay, why, well, their ride was awful short-lived as I remember.
Yeah.
And what happened there?
Well, the only thing wrong with Air Ride was it didn't have reliability.
Minor problem.
Yeah. And nobody seemed to care about it anyhow.
Uh-huh.
I don't know of anybody that bought a car because it had Air Ride or even rejected one because it had Air Ride.
Mhm. Now, we went through a program, didn't we, to, if people had air ride, you could convert it back, so to speak?
You could always do that, but I'm not aware that there was a program where the company would do it for you. The parts were available if you wanted to do it.
If you wanted to do that. What, do you see that as some significant happening there that caused us to have any particular problems or?
No. No, that was the beginning of innovation as far as veteran programs were concerned.
Mhm.
And I think what we learned as much as anything is make sure it's right before you do it.
Did we do a lot of testing on that vehicle prior to the
Yes.
start?
That's pretty interesting. But some of the things we got into in production, I don't think we could have tested for because the climate was. I don't mean the financial climate.
The outdoor
I
climate.
mean the atmospheric climate.
Uh-huh.
See, when you put something in an automobile, it's got to work every month of the year, not just in the summer months or in the winter months.
So it had more difficulties when the weather was cold or damp or something. And somebody, now at some point in time, somebody had to decide, well, we're gonna quit that.
Well, I don't remember how it got turned around, but I'm sure that by 1956 or 7, it wasn't in the picture.
See, let's see, air ride was at 50. No,
53.
53.
no, 53.
53 or 50.
I think it was 58.
It might have carried on that. Hey, I think you're right.
I think it was 58
I think you're right.
and 59 maybe.
Yeah, okay, you're right.
I don't know whether we ever made any 59 with it
Oh,
on,
I don't know if we made any 59s.
with it on it.
I think 58 was the last year. 57 and 58 probably.
Was, was there a lot of machination over it at that time?
No,
People-
everybody was glad to forget it.
Get rid of the thing.
Yeah.
What happened to Buick's air ride? Did they get rid
I
of
think
theirs?
theirs ended up about the same as ours. Like, I don't ever recall seeing a Buick with it on. I wouldn't know for
Well,
sure.
maybe it wasn't Buick, maybe it was Cadillac, or I thought somebody other than us did that.
I thought they did too.
Well,
But you see, we weren't doing
yeah,
any cooperating on it, so
yeah.
it's kind of hazy.
Okay, so that was kind of a 50s sort of thing, and any other, not necessarily that kind of thing, but kind of unique things that were developed in that time frame that you can think back to?
Well, that's when the corporation started putting out a concept car every year, a Motorama car.
The F-88, our car, or what were those?
The Golden Rocket,
The Golden
Yeah,
Rocket,
those cars.
those cars.
the Delta.
What happened to those vehicles?
Oh, they're still around, probably down at the starting section.
Do we keep those things, or did we keep those forever, kind of?
Did they ever get out? Were they ever sold on?
No, they were never sold. They were never sold because there'd be no service on them, see? I have a recollection of a car we sold in California. that had some stuff on it which there was no service available, and it backfired.
Oh, is that a company, kind of a company car or
Well,
engineering
yeah,
car?
it was a production Starfire that, Mr. Wolfram had made available to, Helen, no, Henderson, what was her name?
Oh,
Florence
Florence Henderson,
Yeah.
yes,
She was our national figure.
yeah,
We made it
Lucille.
available for her and one for her understudy. And, that's the only thing, on these cars that wasn't production was a molding that went down the side for a special side treatment. And, so they said, well, they'd take a chance on selling those in California rather than bringing them back, and they did. I guess they sold them with the idea there was no service on this particular molding and that. But about 6 months later, we got a request for one of these moldings. Somebody had broadsided this guy and spoiled his molding. Well, there was no supply of them. They weren't a production item. They had to be hand cast on brass, and hand finished and everything. And rather than tell the guy that we couldn't make him one, we figured out how much it would cost to make one and see if he wanted it. So it was gonna cost about $1,200 to get a molding. We wrote and told him that, and that's the end of it. We were getting one.
George T. Jones. This is tape 2 of 2 tapes. The recording was made on November 22nd, 1988.
George, the concept cars like those that were made in those days, dreamed those up.
Well, there wasn't so much new on the cars mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing new on the cars would be what we'd have to change to adapt it to the contours that were conceived by styling for the overall car. And we used to work closely with them on that.
So styling kind of created all these new vehicle looks.
So it was more cosmetic than it was mechanical.
Say that again?
It was more cosmetic, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah,
than
yeah.
mechanical.
Yeah.
So, but there wouldn't be any way one of those cars would get out and be licensed and titled
No.
and sold, would
There
there?
was a policy against that because there was absolutely no service on the cars.
I see.
It's interesting. Now we made a lot of those in the 50s,
Sure did.
and then we kind of quit doing that.
Well, they stopped the GM Motoramas.
Yeah, when they didn't have the Motoramas, there wasn't much reason to
make
make them.
uh-huh.
George, now this, to get back to that F-88, were there three, like an F-88-1, an F-88-2, and an F-88-3 made? Do you recall that?
I don't recall what you mean by the F-88.
That was an experimental car, 1953. We have a picture in our file.
Let's see it.
All right, when we're finished here, we can do
Drag
that.
that out. There appears like, in that case, like there may be more than one version of that made.
Because we have a story in our file that says F-88-3, Roman numeral 3.
Well, if I could see the particular car,
It may
it might
jog your memory.
jog my memory.
You might be fine, we can do that. So those cars ended primarily at the end of the 50s. What you're saying,
Yes.
the dream cars.
Everything was done to get some kind of publicity. See?
Yes.
And by the time 1961 rolled around, we had another project. We were making a car specially available through the Washington zone to Jacqueline Kennedy.
Well, what was that?
That was a Starfire.
Okay.
It was a production Starfire with a convertible with a bubble top. Like they had a big bubble top for the
Mm-hmm.
president on his
Mhm.
limousine. Well, we made a bubble top for Jackie's convertible. That the top had all the shapes approximating convertible
Mm-hmm.
shape. However, they were smoothed out and purified for better appearance and things like that.
Was that bubble top bulletproof?
Was it removable? A removable
Yes.
top?
Removable and would fit the same attachments that the convertible top did.
Mhm.
All you had to do was drop the convertible, put the boot on, hoist the bubble top up, clamp it on.
Was the boot then a fabric boot or a plastic boot?
Well, it was a plasticized fabric,
Okay.
That's just-
vinyl.
Mhm.
Well, was that an option that anyone could buy?
No,
That was
no.
customized for her?
That's got a little history.
Okay.
The thing was styled, the shape of the styling section. And then the actual procurement of the car was turned over to Metro Bentley. Station. Excuse me, talking too much.
Would you like a glass of water or coffee or something?
No.
Sure, let me get you a glass of water.
Anyhow, Metro Bentley worked closely with Creative Industries in Detroit. And we used to go down there on our various trips to Detroit and oversee up to they finally got this model satisfactorily, and then they had to make a mold, from which to make a pattern
Mm-hmm.
for a permanent mold, you know. Well, we finally got far enough along to make a molding, and this would be the how I wrote it on vacuum form. That's
Okay.
heated up.
Yeah.
Vacuum form. They had to make 11 of them before they got one that was satisfactory.
Oh, wow.
And before they could even make one, they had to take a special furnace that they had at Cadillac Plastics, raise it up in the air 2 feet to get this thing. And complications, nothing insurmountable, but it shows you what people were willing to do to accomplish something.
Uh-huh.
And and after we got to making them so that they were satisfactory for consideration, we had to put 200 man hours of polishing them,
So you could get
get it nice looking,
so you could look through it. Okay.
and get the optics
Uh-huh.
good shape. And the first one cost us $26,000. I'll remember that. Now that involved tools for all
Sure.
the moldings that had to fit above the doors
Yeah.
and fit the C line and everything.
Yeah.
And we sent it down to Washington. And we never did hear about how the White House felt about it. I never saw a picture of Jackie in it.
Oh, I'll be darned.
But anyhow, I have a picture of the car before I went to Washington. And so after we had all this money involved in it, we thought, well, gee, we might as well get one for ourselves. Because we had the tools, you see.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It'd be much less than
Next one's cheap.
$26,000.
Mm-hmm.
So the next one only cost us like about, I think, $7,000 or $8,000 to get one for ourselves. And as long as we didn't change the C line on that line of B cars,
Mm-hmm.
this and the windshield pillar area,
Mm-hmm.
that would always fit. You see, it fit for 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we got it, and I used to drive it. It was my car, whatever I wanted it. Oh, I liked it in the wintertime, but I didn't want any part of it in the summertime.
Oh boy, that was hot.
Summertime, it was just like sitting under interrogation lamps.
Yeah.
But in the wintertime, that was a very pleasant automobile.
Uh-huh.
If there was sun shining, it would warm up the inside, because
Yeah.
we had a heater anyhow.
Yeah.
And Dick Steele and I used to drive that car back in Detroit all winter, lots of times in our shirt sleeves. And we'd pass cars going down the road with guys all bundled up in overcoats and everything. And it was a fun car to drive in a snowstorm. You see the snow coming at you.
Oh yeah, flowing over.
Boy, you could make a real study of aerodynamics on that one.
Helen, do you want to get a copy of that picture?
Sure.
And
Take your key.
Excuse the interruption, George.
it's okay. I can use it.
Yeah. Well, after you've talked for an hour and a half, it gets a little bit hoarse.
Anyhow, well, about a month after we sent that car down there, we had just gotten our own for our own use. We got a rush call from Washington for another one. Somebody had taken this thing off, set it down on the garage floor someplace, and somebody backed into it and cracked it. Didn't spoil any of the moldings or anything, but
Yeah.
it cracked the molded roof. So we sent our own down there. Fortunately, we haven't.
Yeah.
But we requested that they send the other one back, all pieces.
Mhm.
In the meantime, we ordered another molded part,
Sure.
and then Mitchell Bentley furnished this piece with all the moldings on it they had taken off the one that somebody run into.
Mhm.
Well, we kept that one around for at least 4 years. And a lot of people wanted to buy it, like story old.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But they wouldn't sell it to them. Particularly after this experience out in California was this one with the molding.
Mhm.
But it would have been less of a gamble than even that one, because if this one got broken, you just pork it.
Yeah, well, you had your regular top.
That's right.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't sell it anyhow.
Mhm.
They scrapped it eventually. But my wife never liked to ride in it. She always says, well, she didn't, out in the country where you could see the moon and the stars and that,
Yeah.
she didn't mind that. Or in the rain, that was kind of fun. But in town, she says, I always feel like I'm on display.
In a fishbowl.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's interesting. Was that a thing that we just decided to do, or was that a thing that we were requested?
My understanding was that it was a suggestion that came from the Washington zone.
Oh, yes. Mhm.
And we acquiesced.
Oh, sure. And that was
61.
61.
That fit the 62 and the 63 and the
Mhm.
64. I think it fit the 65, I'm not sure.
Because that was the start of that new body cycle. George, did you do any work on the little F-85 at that time? 61-ish?
Well, at this time I was body engineer.
Oh,
I was
okay.
in charge of all the sheet metal and everything.
Yeah.
Well, we was in charge of more than that. When I was called in, the main body engineer, I was told that, they asked me, I forget how it was presented, but it said something about they'd like me to consider being body engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember telling them, well, I wasn't going to turn it down without trying it. And then there was just one thing. I had to take the radiator installation and the steering wheel along with me. Those used to be in the chassis.
Mhm.
Oh, and I had to take the bumpers too,
Mm.
because up till this time, I was the only guy that ever did bumpers
Mhm.
after World War II. And I told him, well, yeah, I could do all of that, but why didn't they let me take the men that were doing it? And
Mhm.
I trained it.
Mhm.
So they did. So that's how we got that stuff transferred to the
When did you become body engineer, George?
1958.
58.
I hired Stemple.
You hired Stemple. How about that? Tell us about him. What did he do in the early days?
What was he hired in as?
Hired in as I think he was hired in as a junior layout man. Well, I remember these cars.
Okay.
These were concept cars.
Right.
54.
This was a 54?
Well, that's what we show. All this story about this spec
Oh, they could be.
is dated 59, but this is F-88-3,
Well,
which led us to believe there could have been two previous.
I know that there was one like this.
That looks like a Corvette body, is what it looks like.
Well, it was a takeoff of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know about this one, but I
That's
do
the
know.
rear of the same
I
kind.
do know that Hardy Earl had one of his own, just like this. It was a Corvette body, but he wanted an Oldsmobile engine in it, because in those days, Oldsmobile was the engine.
Right.
And I have pictures of the chassis that's in this thing too.
Huh. Oh, well, that would be interesting.
This is the instrument pan
Yeah.
front seat.
Hardy Earl had one of these. It was his very own, and it used to come back in to the engineering department every spring after he was coming home from Florida. to be, overhauled.
He had that after he left General Motors
Oh,
even?
yeah.
So he drove, that was licensed and titled to drive on the
Oh,
highway then.
Yes.
Mhm. Wonder what happened to that vehicle?
Well, I'm sure it's in the archives down at Tech Center.
You don't think that one could have got sold, do you? Okay. So those were, that particular one, you think maybe was a takeoff on the Corvette
Oh, I'm
body?
sure it was,
Uh-huh.
yes. The Corvette had just been introduced
Yeah,
about the year.
and it had the old straight six in it though.
Well, I don't know what was in it, but Marty Earl wasn't about to have one of them. He wanted one of Oldsmobile's
Yeah,
Kettering engines in it.
yeah,
So you hired Bob Stemple.
yeah. Tell us
as
about,
a
Well,
Senior
that.
project engineer, was it?
well,
Yeah. I remember the day he came in for an interview. I don't know where he had been before he talked to me, but I was under the impression that I was one of the first guys to talk to me. And, well, a more likable guy, you couldn't conjure up. But he was a big fellow, you know, he's 6 foot, something or other. And he used to have a brush cut, he was just fresh out of the army, but very polite. Very profuse on the use of the word Mr. with Mr. Jones. And I've never gotten used to that, particularly from these big guys. These guys have always harassed me. Instead of calling him Mr. Anyhow, we had a nice chat. And I knew right from the time I started talking with him, I wanted to hire him. But you have to go through a mental process of figuring out what you're gonna do with him and everything like this. And after talking with him for an hour or more, I had my mind made up. So I started picking his brain a little bit and wanted to know how much money he'd like to have to come to work and all this and that. On the pretense that maybe I couldn't afford him, you know. And he didn't pull any bones. He says, well, sir, Mr. Jones, he says, I'm not looking for a job, any particular job. He says, what I really want is an opportunity. Well, that was a new approach. And asked him how much money he wanted, and well, whatever you think I'm worth and where you're gonna put me. Well, how are you gonna judge it? You can't assess a man's worth that way. What you have to be careful is if you've got about 30 other guys working for you, that you fit him in there in some spot that's fair to him and not an insult to the other people.
mhm.
So I made him a junior layout man. And about 3 weeks after he'd been on the job, I knew that I had underrated him terribly. And I told him so. I told him he'd be patient, we'd get him a raise. And before I got around to getting him a raise, I was promoted to body engineer. That was in the chest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So all I could do was go and tell his new boss what I thought of what I did. I guess he progressed since then.
Slightly.
Let's see, now he was a GMI graduate.
No,
What was his schooling and out of what
some
college?
school in the east.
Was that, no, that wasn't, no,
What was his degree?
Rensselaer? No, that was,
Mechanical engineering.
wasn't Rensselaer, that was.
Rensselaer, that's it.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. Bob Dorshamer, I knew was from Rensselaer, too. Also,
Well, then maybe I'm.
I think it's
confused there.
Dorshamer that's Rensselaer. I can't remember where Stemple's from.
Well, I have it at home. I can look it up.
Yeah, that's all right.
And we have his bio
Yeah,
here too.
I'm sure we,
But, oh, I see him every now and then. He hasn't changed. He's still the same old ball. He was in my retirement party. I got some pictures up there. I got one of them that I don't think he'd ever like to see. I'm not going to show it to anybody, but I'm not going to throw it away either. But he's caught with his mouth open and his eyes shut.
photographs are a funny thing.
But he was an unusual employee from the word go. If you'll turn that machine off for a minute, I'll tell you a funny one. I'm not gonna tell her.
No,
Oh, no, no.
no, that's all right. Tell us about the F-85, George.
Well, the F-85 was, that
61.
was a cooperative program between Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile.
Right.
Yeah, that was the beginning of that series of car. It was in for 6 or 7 years.
What,
What did you do on
Yeah.
that?
Oh, I just had instrument panels and, front end sheet metal and bumpers and stuff like that. I wasn't in mechanical stuff at that time.
But it was an intermediate car, so it was considerably smaller than,
Well, it wasn't an intermediate, it was a small car.
well, it was a compact, only they
It was a
didn't use the
compact, that's
term
right.
compact.
The A car was, the intermediate car in those days.
mhm.
This was up beneath that.
Wasn't it about a foot and a half shorter than the 98?
More
Well, it's more than that. Yeah.
could have been a foot and a half shorter than 88.
Sure.
But anyhow, that was what they come up with, the jet fire in that particular,
Mm-hmm.
which was a
1962,
62, something like that.
62 and 63, they made the jet fire with a turbo rocket,
Turbo.
fluid
charged
injected
rocket.
engine.
What, do you remember what precipitated that particular size and kind of car before 61? Why we did
Well,
that?
I don't remember anything pertaining to that model, but it's got to be the same thing that precipitates everything, economics and sales. Somebody thought there was a market for it.
Uh-huh.
Well, there were a lot of imports coming in from
Yes, yeah, that
that were
probably
smaller than the.
was as inspirational as anything.
Were you feeling any of that in that particular end of the business that you were doing? You weren't feeling any pressure, so to
Well,
speak?
I didn't feel any pressure to get into it. We used to have evaluation sessions with all these foreign cars.
Mm-hmm.
We'd meet representatives from the various divisions and all the Hondas and Mazdas
Mm-hmm.
coming into Japan. We try and give our opinion on things like that. And I gotta say that generally we come off those things with pretty good impressions of them. Not so much their human accommodations as the mechanical excellence of the
Mhm.
product. They got smarter on human accommodations a few years later.
What about the quality?
Uh, Quality is something that I have never been able to find the Japanese too short on. If you're talking about visual quality. Durability, all I have to go by is my recollection of proving ground records at that time. They never put out a car that was as durable as an American car.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's still true. And, I worked in Japan for a couple of months on the World Car Project,
When was that, George?
1979.
Okay.
And
What was the purpose of that program?
well, that was the beginning of trying to get this world car thing started.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to know some of the Japanese fellows over there quite well. And they're likable people. They have a work ethic that you can't argue with.
Mm-hmm.
They have some peculiarities that are pretty hard to live with, but you can't argue with their work ethics. One of the things I found out is that, boy, there's no way they're going to tell you no. They might have their mind made up they aren't going to do it, but they won't tell you no.
Mm-hmm.
They just procrastinate until you draw the conclusion.
You worked, how long did you work on the World Car program?
Well, I worked in the world program for several years, but it wasn't all in Japan. I worked in
Mhm.
Germany too. So-
Mm-hmm.
And that was a real education for me. I found out before you could make any progress on the target problem or anything like that, you got to have a merging of personalities, international personalities.
Mhm.
Some of these things have to be satisfied before you can work on what you're saying over there.
Now, did that eventually materialize in a program of some kind?
Well,
Was that the J-car thing?
I
maybe?
don't know just how far it did finally materialize, but the concept was that you'd work around a certain size automobile. And the body work was always the thing that kept cars from being brought out on time or changing or things like that. So they got all the body engineering in shape for a certain size model. And then the various people that were going to participate in the program would be brought in to work on it. The idea was you could make your own suspension, you could make your own fuel lines, you could make your own anything,
Mhm.
as long as the attachments for that in the body were the same as somebody else's.
Mhm.
Now, body panels all had to have the same weldments into the body in white. But now the detail of the panel in between the weldments,
Mhm.
that could be specific. But I don't think that was ever pursued to the nth degree.
Okay.
But that was the concept.
Mhm. Were you there with were you doing that as an individual, or did you have a group of folks from?
I was just there as Oldsmobile's representative
Okay.
on the philosophy of the program.
All right.
So you really didn't have to feel responsible for someone else who was working with you.
No, no. Most of it was just getting acquainted with the foreign organizations. Some of them were a real revelation, I'll tell you.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'll tell you one incident that happened in North Germany. We were talking about uh, a world car concept, and we were talking about the various chassis elements. And the subject of this particular meeting was brakes. Now, the guy from Buick was in charge of the brakes on cars. That used to be Buick's divisional responsibility. And he was working closely with a man from Germany. What's the name of that German car?
Opal?
Opal. And the young fellow that was doing it was a real fine gentleman. I found out that these younger people over there aren't too much different than us. It's these old autocratic Prussians that have been on their own for years ahead. Those are the ones you have to
Mhm.
watch out for. And this nice German engineer was telling it just the way he understood it. And then when he got through making a point, he turned to his Buick man and he'd say, "Now, isn't that right?" He'd say, "Yes." As far as I was concerned, that was great. They were doing great. But this German Prussian manager had pounded the table all of a sudden, and he says, "I say to you, if you knows how it is, you tells them. You don't ask them." Had to get that German
Mhm.
flavor in there, you see. And a couple of us made up our mind right there that if he ever interfered with us when we were making a talk, we knew just what we were going to say to him. I had mine all made up. I was going to tell him that I say to you, I'm telling you the way I understand it. And if you don't like it, you can tell it the way you understand it when it's your turn.
Mhm.
But I never had a chance to recite that.
When did you retire, George?
1980.
1980.
I had 46 years in. My ring only says 45, but that's because they only put them on it.
Every 5 years, right.
Yes.
But then I worked 2 years after that on contract.
Uh-huh.
So I got a total of 48 years in service.
Okay. You know, you stayed as the body engineer, so to speak, from the 60s through,
No.
what happened there?
1971, I was made um, executive engineer.
Okay, what did the executive engineer get to do?
Well, he did about everything the chief engineer didn't have time to do.
Hmm.
That's the way I could figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody ever told me, you do this, you do that.
See, was that Claire Harrington's job? Did he have that job?
Harrington was just in
Oh,
charge.
he was administrative engineer. I'm sorry, wrong person. Yeah. Okay, executive engineer.
But now that you mentioned Harrington, that brings up an interesting point. I thought that I was the guy that hired Stemple.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since he's gained prominence, I find out there's a couple other guys that think they hired him too.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
One of them is Matt Campbell.
Oh, yeah, Matt told us he hired him.
Matt claims he hired him.
Yeah, Matt did.
Well, I got that straightened out with Matt.
Oh,
Matt signed him up, but I'm the guy that initiated the work to get him signed up.
oh, okay.
But I saw Claire Harrington here in a restaurant, last summer. And he intimated to me that he hired.
Oh.
Well, I didn't argue with him, but I don't think he's right.
Okay, the executive engineer then is the right-hand man of the chief engineer.
Well, he was at that time. I don't know what he is today.
Okay, but when you were there, and
Chief engineers did you work for in that
Well,
capacity?
I worked for, in that
As
capacity?
an executive engineer?
Well, I worked for Howard Curl and Bushman.
Mhm.
That's all it was.
What kind of a man was Mr. Carroll to work with?
Okay, what kind of a man was Mr. Dorshimer to work with?
Well, most of the people that I ever worked with in Oldsmobile were real fine gentlemen in every sense of the word.
Okay.
But then you retired as executive engineer.
Yes.
George, can you describe some of what might be some typical jobs a executive engineer might do?
Well, the thing that
Okay.
my responsibilities kind of grew at Tech Center. When I first went down there, I think I got sent down there because I was so familiar with the place. I had been going down there since they built ground for it, you know. Wow. And then they started doing things at Tech Center with representatives from the various divisions working on them. You know, we'd send some design engineers down, but Buick would send some down, Pontiac would send some down, and they'd work on a project. Well, as long as I was down there, well, it was my responsibility to see that these men were doing what they were supposed to do. And that was very simple. You didn't have any trouble with it. But I used to go to, well, the last 15 years I worked, I drove to Detroit back every day.
It's quite a drive.
Well,
You spent a lot of time on the highway.
yeah, but I used to be one of the best prepared guys at a meeting. When I got there at 8 o'clock in the morning, there'd be these other fellows coming from across the lot. They couldn't even make it on time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I didn't have to drive down every day. I mean, I could have stayed down there if I wanted to. But the truth was, against it, I went to my motel and cleaned up, went out to dinner and got back home and settled down. I could be home.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no point in staying down there. The Detroit doesn't have that much allure for me.
But and so then your tasks were basically what, coordination sort of things, or?
Well, if there was coordination problems, yeah, but there were very few of those. Mine was just overseeing. And if there was anything that had to be done in any particular offices down there, I'd get a telephone call and I'd do it. Things like that.
Did you work much with John Biltz?
Oh, I worked a lot with John Biltz. Not as chief engineer. Well, I worked as a chief engineer, but not as executive engineer. I was body engineer, and he was chief. Yeah, John was a real pleasure to work with.
Mm-hmm.
You get men like Earl Metzel, John Biltz. So the guys like that don't come along every day. It's a real pleasure to know them. Well, Pete, I put Pete Estes in the same class.
Mhm.
Nicest thing that ever happened to me was last November, just about a year ago. I met Pete. In Flint,
Mhm.
SAE. We sat down, had a nice 45-minute talk. Cause I used to know Pete very, very well. We used to go out to his house in England.
Mhm.
And I'm awfully glad that happened. Because
And then he died in March.
we had that heart
Yeah.
attack. I'd have been cheated if I hadn't had that talk.
That's right.
Would you have time today to stop at Leavenworth and have your picture taken, George?
I'm gonna get my picture taken, I want to go home. Clean up.
Oh,
You
no,
look
no, no.
fine, you look fine. Really, it's only about 5 minutes.
It's only this part of his shot.
Yes.
Oh, like, that's over at William Street.
Yeah,
Olds
it's
Avenue.
9 West Street, but it's on the corner of West and Olds.
Just about 3
And,
blocks to the west
if
of
you
the plant.
want me to, I could. Maybe about 4 o'clock, would that be, we got about 1:45 or 12:45? Would that be convenient with you? Unless you've got something.
Why don't you use my official Oldsmobile picture?
Oh, no.
They're taking new pictures in connection with the oral history program.
So we can put a picture with the tape.
I look more retired.
That's what you're supposed to look like.
Now, you're not working now up here at EDC West.
No, this has been my year to cop out, I'll tell you. Boy, in March, I had prostate surgery.
Gracious.
In May, I had a cataract removed from my right eye. In August, I had a slight heart attack. In September, I had a cataract removed from my left eye. I'm just getting over it now.
Well, now you ought to be in good shape for the next 10 years.
Yes, my eyes are gonna be better than they have been for the last 20 years.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I just think you're doing fine.
That's great.
And this heart attack thing, it's funny, I never knew I had it.
Huh.
I was working out in the yard for, well, I guess I spent about 6 hours out there altogether. On one of the real hot days last summer. I wasn't pushing it, I was just out there doing, punching around, you know. That night, I couldn't go to sleep. I, in no particular agony or anything, but I just couldn't go to sleep. Well, after a couple hours, I finally did go to sleep. Now that's unusual for me because my big problem is staying awake till I get in bed. But anyhow, I woke up the next morning and gee, I felt like $1 million. So I went out and worked a couple more hours. And around about noon, I began to feel a little bit, I couldn't define it. I just didn't feel right. So I told my wife, I think I call the doctor and see if he can put a finger on it. So I went out to my doctor. Didn't get good going over, couldn't find anything wrong. Then finally he said, well, he said, I suppose, he says, we're going to give you an EKG just to cover all the bases. So he gave me an EKG and compared it with what he'd taken up within a year and come back into the point. He said, I don't know when you had it. He said, but you sure had a heart attack. That's the only recollection I have of it.
Interesting.
But I learned one thing. Once they make that diagnosis on you, you might as well be a basket case. I wasn't even allowed to go in my own automobile from his office to the hospital. I had to go in an ambulance. I suspect a little insurance double dipping there or something like that. Or else, that's a bad loss.
Everybody shut this off.